It's 2014 at the Doncaster Dome in Great Britain. Over 2,000 spectators sit to watch this year's iteration of Britain's Strongest Man, where 13 of the strongest men in the country compete in various extreme events to determine an ultimate champion. Today is the final day of competition, and with only 2 events left, the 2 favorites to win this year find themselves at an unexpected 2nd and 4th place, and an extreme underdog finds himself at the top of the leaderboard, although by a slim margin. The penultimate event is known as the Conan's wheel, where competitors have to lift up a bar which weighs more than 660 pounds and walk in a circle until they drop it. The competitors are ranked and given points based on the amount of distance they are able to walk with the bar measured in degrees. All but 3 competitors have had their turn, with an average of 1 full rotation around the circle, and the best being just above 2. With the 2 favorites breathing down his back, Eddie Hall, who had placed last in this championships last year, aims to carry himself to a massive upset win.
Talked earlier in our show about that day when somebody hands him the big trophy. He's not going quite as quickly. Maybe that's just the body style.
Yeah, he's going half the speed of Ben Kelsey, and well, his body shape, you wouldn't expect him to do particularly well here. Starting to struggle a little bit, coming up to 1.5.
How much further will he get? Look, the arms are starting to sink down to his waist. He is barely able to move now. This is mind over matter, and his mind says the pain does not matter. 2 full rotations for Eddie Hall. He is so determined to win this title.
Eddie Hall would soon wake up from the scare caused by his extreme exertion. And that same exertion would ultimately end up making the difference in the event. But more importantly, although no one knew it at the time, it would be the defining characteristic that would lead Hall to his greatest accomplishment.
2, it's all about grabbing the bag now. Who can manhandle it?
Well, whoever comes out on top here will be the British champion, and Hall has turned the lead around.
Hall would end up maintaining his lead in the final event, the Killer Medley, which consisted of a timed race to load 4 250-pound objects into a bin. And in an act of sportsmanship, Eddie Hall took the reins of the title of Britain's Strongest Man. In order to understand the full gravity of this moment, you need to understand what made Eddie Hall's emergence into becoming one of the strongest men on earth rather unlikely.
Yeah.
And
No, it's tough. And I know what you're going to talk about. So it's not easy.
Hall was born on January 15, 1988, in Newcastle-under-Lyme, England, into a lower middle-class family, and the youngest of 3 brothers. Spurred by a culture of sport and competition within his family, it helped him to develop an extreme competitive nature to him, which even at such a young age would become the driving force in his life. By the age of 10, he became a national champion swimmer in 6 different events, and his dominance would continue until he was selected to train for a junior Olympic team, where the training became too regimented, which would ultimately cause him to leave the sport altogether. Eddie leaving his sport, which up to that point had been his life purpose, led him to a life of trouble in and out of school. Partially due to his undiagnosed ADHD, he struggled to behave well at school, getting detentions, suspensions, and eventually expelled. With the sport he relied on no longer being there, and expelled from school, his identity was lost, and he began to go down a dark path.
I mean, so as a 13-year-old kid being prescribed Prozac, which is like an antidepressant, and you're seeing a psychiatrist. So whilst all my mates are at school learning the GCSEs and having fun, you know, I was sat in front of psychiatrists trying to get my life back together. It's hard to talk about because it was
No,
it was a really dark time of my life. I guess it was a wake-up call, you know, because just those 2 years was so miserable. Just like locked in my room on my own, just like literally having the thoughts I wanted to kill myself on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to about, I would say 15 years of age. And my mum sort of sat me down and was like, what the fuck are you going to do? Like, you cannot continue the way you are. You can't stay in your room all day. You can't not go to school. You can't not get a job. You've got to get up and get on with your life. And for whatever conclusion we came to, we decided I was going to join the gym.
The gym became the only thing that Eddie had, and ultimately the thing that saved him. While his friends were at school, he would be at the weight room, where retired lifters took him under their wing and taught him their craft. But more importantly, how to become a man he could be proud of. And despite the difference in the sport compared to swimming, the older lifters discovered that Eddie also had an immense gift for strength. Decades later, Hall would discover he had a rare genetic myostatin deficiency, also known as the Hercules gene, which along with his refound spark for life, led him to making incredible progress. And by the age of 16, Hall grew to over 230 pounds. However, that doesn't explain how he grew to nearly twice that size and achieved the greatest feat in strongman history. And even though he had success in the gym, success in strongman would prove to be a greater challenge. By the age of 19, while being a full-time truck mechanic, he watched the most recent World's Strongest Man competition, and he thought to himself that he can do that. So soon after, he entered his first local strongman competition, where he placed 5th. And afterwards, although he had a decent debut, he would state an almost unfathomable statement to those who heard it. One day, I will be the world's strongest man. And although many doubted him, his results began to dissolve their doubts, as at the age of 22, he won England's strongest man, the youngest to ever do it, and he began to work up the ladder to even bigger competitions, becoming the UK's strongest man in 2011, and qualifying for his first World's Strongest Man competition the following year. And as previously mentioned, he won his first Britain's Strongest Man competition in 2014. However, despite all this progress, he was in some ways a large fish in a small pond, as those at the top of the mountain, the competitors and the winners of World's Strongest Man, were simply on a different level. Hall had failed to make it out of the preliminary rounds of the competition for the first 2 years, and the reasons were becoming clear. These are the heights and weights of some of the most legendary men in strongman history. And the saying that mass moves mass holds clear in this case. Those who weighed more were generally stronger. Most of these legendary competitors were also incredibly tall, so reaching weights of over 400 pounds was generally more feasible. However, for Eddie Hall, standing at a much shorter height in comparison, reaching such a weight would have his BMI quite literally off the charts, and to dangerous levels even compared to the other strongmen. However, to climb the mountain of strongman, Eddie began to push his body like never before.
But it was that training, it was going to the gym and coming back and feeling better about myself. But training for me was my void.
After cementing himself as one of the top contenders for the World's Strongest Man title, Eddie's goals were clear.
I want to win your strongest man, I want to smash the deadlift world record.
However, one would come unexpectedly soon. Shortly after breaking the record, Hall had this conversation with the promoter.
Do you reckon you'd be able to get £1 million off the company if I did 500?
When will you do it by?
I'll wear their logo next year.
For next year?
Next year deadlift.
£1 million in the
£1 million,
deadlift.
then it'll go f***ing viral. I'll have your logo on my chest. The offer's there.
But willing to haggle.
Eddie Hall proposed the impossible idea of lifting 500 kilograms, or over 1,100 pounds. And at first, the promoter and the world thought he was joking and simply saying it for publicity. However, it's hard to blame them. This graph displays the world record progression of the deadlift up until the point that Eddie made this statement. Most jumps in the deadlift world record were around a 1% increase from the previous one, and the more recent ones were less than a fraction of a percent. Eddie's proposed record would be just about an 8% increase from the most recent one, an unparalleled jump in the history of strongman. In fact, it would be an unparalleled jump in the history of the most impressive world records across any sport. And the improbability of the lift in many people's eyes led to a large financial incentive for the lift, and one that Hall would come to rely on. Due to the large costs of training for the sport, his savings were being depleted, and he knew if he wanted to continue with his passion as a way to support his family, he would have to complete such a lift for the potential reward. Hall would place a low-odds 5-figure bet on himself to lift 500 kg the following year, and began training for the hardest lift of his life. Training for the lift proved to be a bigger challenge than he imagined. As similar to everyone around him, he had hit a plateau in his deadlift progression. During the first 4 months of training, he was unable to pass 455 kilograms. And even with all of his willpower and training techniques he had honed through the past decade and a half, he was unable to make the progress he needed to see. When talking with a trainer, he came to the conclusion that he would be unable to lift the 500 kilogram bar when his family depended on it. At least, not through normal means. He began to research any possible way he could break this plateau, and through his research he stumbled upon the secret that seemed like the stuff of legends. In 2012, Steve Kornacki was working on his car when the jack gave out and his BMW 525 fell on top of him, causing him to fracture 5 of his ribs and fall unconscious. That's when his 22-year-old daughter came upon the situation, and in a moment of life or death, she managed to lift the car off her father's body, move him out from under, and give him CPR before taking him to the hospital, where he would make a full recovery. This phenomenon, known as hysterical strength, is the theory that in a situation of life or death, the brain can allow the human body to access nearly 100% of their muscle fibers, about 30% above the natural limit put by the brain to avoid serious injury. It hasn't been studied in a scientific setting due to the potential dangerous repercussions of someone surpassing such a limit, and the unethical nature of putting people in these situations. However, the documented occurrences of this prove that tapping into another level of human strength is possible, and Eddie Hall would decide to take the leap to be the first ever person to apply it in a sports setting. The training for the 500 kilogram deadlift would be on another level compared to anything the world-class strongman had done to that point. Hall would start seeing a hypnotist in order to find out if he could effectively convince himself he was in a life or death scenario when it came to the day where he had to lift the weight.
I started talking with a psychiatrist first about how to sort of dive into this and how to access, get into that part of the brain. And then we turned to a hypnotherapist who ended up working the two together. And we were able to talk about a situation. And this situation was very dark and gloomy. Basically put me in a situation in my head where I'm not lifting a weight off the floor but pulling a person off of my kids. I would lock myself in the toilets at the gym. I would literally stand there staring at myself in the mirror and just wishing, thinking these horrible thoughts, and then I'd kick the door down, go walk up to that bar and rip the bar off the floor.
He would also consume anywhere from about 10 to 12,000 calories in preparation for the lift. He would even wake up in the middle of the night in order to eat extra calories to put on the weight he felt like he needed for the lift. This program would push Eddie Hall to an all-time high in his weight of around 430 pounds. And at 6'2", this weight was extremely dangerous and honestly impressive, as competitors even taller than him were at a similar or less weight. However, despite being heavier and stronger than he had ever been, he never attempted higher than 455 kilogram in training, saying he would leave the 500 kilogram lift for the day itself. And that day soon came. On July 9th, in his home region of England, the 2016 World Deadlift Championships commenced, and the format of the event was simple. Each of the 12 competitors would get 3 attempts at any designated weight of their choice, and they would have to get each lift to move on to the next one. Eddie Hall and several other competitors had the following progression set: 420 kilograms for the first lift, 465 kilograms for the second lift, and the magnum opus of a 500 kilogram attempt for the third lift. Out of the 12 competitors on the day, 8 completed a 420 kilogram lift, and when it was Eddie's turn, it went up faster than ever before. It was clear by his demeanor that Eddie Hall's head was somewhere else, and these first 2 lifts were simply a stepping stone for the ultimate goal. Several other competitors attempted a 465 kilogram lift, but nearly none achieved it. To be fair, 465 kilograms would be a new world record already, breaking the standing world record of 463 kilograms that Eddie Hall set about a year prior. However, 2 competitors were able to get a good shot at 465 kg, and this was Eddie's attempt.
All right, let's go to 500 kilos for a half-ton deadlift.
Then, Eddie was backstage for one more time. All of the training, the excessive eating, the countless hours in the gym, and the hypnotism to try to unlock a new level of strength for human history. Hall looked at himself in the mirror, and he flipped a switch in his mind, and headed out for the lift. As he was getting prepared on stage, the crowd's noise was the loudest it had been the entire night. One look at Eddie Hall and it was clear. It was do or die time for him. He had one moment to prove it was all worth it. Him never believing he would amount to anything as a child. All the people that doubted him when becoming a strongman, and the desire to provide for his family. Just a couple seconds for him to use that all to break the human limit. After completing the lift, Hall spent 6 seconds holding half a ton in his hands, relishing in the history he had just created. The lift itself, and more so the extra time he spent up there, seemed to do irreversible damage to his body. However, what was going on inside his body this time was much more dangerous. But, with one last push of adrenaline, he got up and gave a speech.
I can't believe how many hours of my life I put into this. If it wasn't for this, what would have happened, honestly? Because I was informed. You know, she is my rock.
But as soon as he got backstage, he collapsed again. A team of doctors rushed to attend to him. His ECG readings were impossible to decipher. The doctors believed his heart rate was above 200 beats per minute, and it stayed there. His blood pressure was unreadable, and in this moment, everything seemed uncertain. Although no life-threatening changes occurred, the physical damage on his body would become apparent for the coming days and weeks. He described the time after as having some of the worst brain fog of his life. At his son's birthday party a few days later, he would forget who his brother was. He would be caught repeating the same sentences and having coordination problems attributed to a change in his vision. Hall was experiencing symptoms of a serious concussion, a concussion he gained without even moving his head. In the following weeks, his symptoms would thankfully minimize and eventually dissipate, and a potentially career-ending event would be avoided. The lift would grant Eddie with the financial security to continue the sport of strongman while still being able to support his family. And at World's Strongest Man the next year, after putting a similar level of dedication that he did for the 500 kg lift,
interested to see how Ryan Shaw recovers from competition in the deadlift as Eddie Hall making short order of these stones in ascending order, moving rapidly through the course.
This is his fourth. As long as he doesn't have a huge mistake, he's gonna win it, and he does!
he won. That would ultimately mark the end of his strongman career.
The world's strongest man! Right here!
He would compete one more time, at the place where his rise to the top began, at the Britain's Strongest Man competition, in order to become the only man to win the competition 5 times, which he did, and fully retired from the sport on afterwards. Strongman is an unbelievably tough sport on the body, and Eddie Hall retired primarily because he wants to be around for his family. Although he doesn't compete anymore, his legend still stands. He starred in a couple Hollywood films and even competed in a couple boxing and MMA fights, one with a longtime rival. And transitioning into the next phase of his life, he's passed the love of weightlifting on to his son. His son, which he's given an infinitely more stable childhood to than he had. And the deadlift world record would go unbroken for another 4 years, until his longtime rival, Hafthor Bjornsson, would put up a 501 kilogram deadlift in 2020, a 0.2% improvement on the world record, although it was outside of an official competition. The personal pride of who owns the record would lead to an altercation previously mentioned. However, as time passes, the next generation of strongmen continue to train to pass the 500 kilogram barrier, as none other than these two have. However, someday the record will likely be broken, whether it be 505 or 510 kilograms. But regardless of what the record is, no one can recreate what Eddie Hall did. The dedication to push himself to a mental space no one had even went to when training for sports, and to go beyond what a person of his stature could even look like and eventually accomplish. The sheer jump in the record is nearly unparalleled in any other sport, and the confidence it took to break a barrier such as 500 kilograms with such a jump will never be seen again in the sport. As time passes, debates will take place. Was that lift the greatest of all time? Was Eddie Hall even the greatest strongman of all time? Did he really surpass the human limit? Did he live up to the greatest version of himself? Did he prove to all humans they have a strength in them beyond what they ever thought was possible? Well, in that moment, he undeniably did.